All right. What is happening, everybody? Black Level live stream. Here we are. Always good to be back from the Telemark bunker here in Utah and to check in with all of you. Thank you for your support at the Black Level and hope you're digging the live streams and getting those back on track. I always enjoy doing these. I know the podcasts have been a little more inconsistent, so it's nice when I can pop in and do these and let everybody know what's going on. So I've got a cool little topic we're going to do today. I'm going to talk about some of my favorite spring Telemark setups and some stuff you guys can think about maybe to enjoy the spring snow that's either upon you, depending on where you live, or is going to be upon you sooner than later. So before I get into that, I wanted to do a little bit of not a ton of news, but I did put up, if you haven't checked it out and you're watching this video, maybe before you get to it, I've got the latest Behind the Free Heel Life up. A couple minutes just kind of catching up on what's going on. I was getting some sweet powder turns at a small Utah mom and pop resort. That's kind of what I've been up to lately, is trying to kind of get away from the crowds. I actually skied Park City with a friend of mine the other day. Whew, it was crazy. It took us almost an hour to get on the gondola, and then we finally got going, and it was a little tricky, though. So I definitely am sticking to either going to my local backcountry hideouts near my place or trying to hit some of these mom and pop resorts that I've either been to or maybe haven't been to as much in the past. And just found out today I'm actually going to be heading up to Wyoming to hit a little spot up there with some buddies of mine. And I'm really looking forward to that. So, but also I announced in the Behind the Free Heel Life episode 2 podcasts that are coming up. And I've really tried to not, I'm going to probably start doing some solo ones too, but I've really tried to start putting some effort into getting some of these historical characters that have been on my tick list for so long. Because I want to make sure to capture their stories. If they're willing to talk to me, it's really, really important for me to capture these earlier eras. So this week I'm going to be recording a podcast with a gentleman by the name of Armand Dubuque. And he's got a really, really interesting story. I'll actually show you. So he created this binding, and you guys are kind of getting a sneak peek of this. This is called the UTB, or Ultimate Telemark Binding. Okay. And you'll hear it in the story. He basically kind of conceived this idea in the mid to late 90s and then kind of brought it to life, I think around 1999 or something. Obviously, we'll hear more about that in the story. But this has always been a part of my collection that I've always really admired, because if you know when this came about, it's got some features that were very, very unique to his design early on. And one of the main ones is that he had a hard wire long before anybody else did. And we're going to talk about that in the podcast, into these compression springs. What's interesting about this is, he's got a super heavy duty toe piece. You might notice these little spikes up front. It's a little hard when I'm looking in the into the camera here. This is actually a crampon, and you can see these little crampon spikes are underneath. And so this was long before there was a free pivot tour mode. But basically you could release this part of the binding on your boot and leave this piece on, this would stay on the ski. And he actually had a really cool flip up heel climbing post. I'm trying to think what it's similar to. Probably in a modern one, it's kind of like Majo or Rotofella Freeride, where the whole piece flips up. So very, very unique. Anyways, Armand Dubuque, we're going to be talking to him, or I'm going to be talking to him here later this week. And I think that one's actually going to be a phone interview, which I haven't done in a while. Because he's kind of off grid, and we've had a hard time sort of testing the video portion. So I'm excited either way. Just documenting that story is going to be great. The second one is my good friend Dickie Hall, who, if anyone's been around Telemark in the last, 30, 40 years, you've probably heard the name Dickie Hall. He's a Telemark ski pioneer. His biggest contribution was not, it's typically associated with New England and the Northeast of the United States, but his influence has definitely reached much further than that. He had a company called NATO, North American Telemark Organization, and he did clinics and festivals and gatherings and trips and all sorts of things for about 40 years. And he retired a number of years ago, and just a really cool guy. And I'm really, really excited to talk to him. I was chatting with him yesterday on the phone, kind of testing things out. And that one should be video if we can get everything going good. I'm really, really pumped about those 2 episodes, and I can't wait to share them with you. So again, thanks for your subscriptions to the membership level on YouTube that allows me to do this stuff and get this information out and document it all so that we can make sure Telemark history sort of stays in the mix. All right. So we're going to talk about spring skiing. So I love skiing. I love Telemark skiing any time of year, but spring skiing kind of has a unique feel to it for me. March is kind of an interesting month in Utah because it's statistically usually the biggest snow month that we get, but it's also the time when kind of, we've gone through all the major holidays, Thanksgiving, Christmas, Martin Luther King, and President's Day. And those are kind of the 4 major ski vacation weekends, throughout the ski year, I guess, especially from a business standpoint. Usually once we get through February, things start to taper off. People start thinking about golfing and mountain biking and hiking and doing all sorts of stuff. And especially in the Midwest to the East Coast, usually winter's sort of tapering off a lot more at that point. People are starting to think about fishing and traveling, doing all sorts of other stuff. But especially here in Utah, what I love is things usually start quieting down at the resorts. Obviously, the backcountry gets good. Things start to settle out, which in Utah is going to be good this year because we've kind of had an unstable snowpack, and it's been difficult for, to get out and really know the snow is going to be stable and whatnot. So spring skiing is a great time to try some new stuff, tweak all that equipment, and kind of get into some new aspects of Telemark. Maybe you haven't. And I think, me personally, the snow's usually a little softer, squishier, wet. It's kind of fun. And that's usually when I'm down to try some stuff maybe I'm, not used to doing as much. So first setup I'm going to talk about is bump skiing. Anybody who's listened to the podcast or any of my videos for a long time know that I love bump skiing, and it's probably because I came into Telemark skiing in the early 90s, and it was sort of this rite of passage to be a bump skier as a Telemark skier. And the old timers would sort of say, hey, if you want to be a good tele skier, you got to get in the bumps. And what I've thought about over and over again for years is bumps create they create these obstacles, obviously naturally on the snow, that really allow us to learn how to maneuver and utilize our technique to maneuver through these bumps. You're not just, unlike carving or learning how to make turns on the snow, bumps allow us to, you could crisscross over a lot of bumps, but you have to start using sort of the up and down motion as you're using this movable stance to absorb the bumps as you're going through stuff. And I think that's so crucial. So bumps are just a great way to become a better Telemark skier. And then as you get in to having a good bump line, what we would call in the old days a zipper line, because if you look down it looks like a zipper. You can see the bumps overlaid over each other, and it makes it super tight. Why I like this for spring is spring bump lines are the best in my opinion, because you got a little bit of slush, you got a little bit of give. it's there to sort of push against that snow, and it's a little more forgiving. If you crash, it's fun. You're not just getting wrecked on a set of icy bumps, and that's never that fun. So I think spring's a great time to get in to telemark skiing and bumps if you haven't done it, and it's a little less threatening. So let's talk a little bit about what that setup looks like. And I know not everybody's got the ability to get, different setups for each type of telemark skiing, and I totally understand that. But I'm going to throw some ideas out. So if you do come across some additional equipment, or maybe you want to make a purchase, this is a good time of year too. Retailers, this is when they start slashing the prices. They got to get rid of stuff. And, all the ski bums start selling their gear. People are trying to make money to get their mountain bike equipment and everything else. So what I would suggest is, for a bump setup specifically, is obviously go a little bit shorter. I mean, if you really want to kind of get good at bumps, you can get good at bumps with longer skis. I mean, I was skiing, 200s when I started skiing bumps, a lot skinnier skis, but this is a different era. I'm probably, I'm about 6 foot. I'm probably going to dip down to like a 174, somewhere in that range. Typically I ski like a 184. I'm going to try and find something, maybe it's a little softer, although, flex, I'd rather short over the flex. But if you can get kind of like a nice soft ski, not too soft in the tails, but just kind of, nice even flex, and get it in like a shorter ski. So for me at 6 foot, I'm thinking 174. I'm going to mount it about the same. And this just allows you got to remember, when you're going into that telemark turn, you're essentially taking two skis and you're elongating them into one longer single ski. I mean, that's kind of the concept of the telemark turn, is making one long ski that's making a turn. So to fit inside these tight bumps, in these zipper lines, as you get better and better and better, shorter skis make it a little easier. So I also, if you've listened to any of the stuff that I've talked about, boots and bindings, a lot over the last, 5 years, I've talked a lot about having a softer boot, with softer spring settings on my bindings, whether it's NTN 75 millimeter. I typically like to have kind of something a little bit softer that allows me to get into the turn faster, unlike like a carving setup where I want to have something a little stiffer, where I can just rail the turn for a long, drawn out GS style turn. Something with bumps is I want to be able to get in, and I want to be able to switch those feet as fast as possible. And so that's why I like a nice even flex ski, something that's going to kind of squish into the bump. It's going to fit inside of these little tight spaces, and softer boot and softer springs. I don't really personally want a stiff setup. Again, this is all personal opinion. You find what works for you, but that's kind of what I'm always thinking about, in terms of bumps and trees and tight maneuvering, is I like to have a little softer setup on the springs and a softer boot. So I've talked a little bit this year about, the new TX Pro. I mean, that's plenty soft. I mean, I'd feel comfortable being in like an OG TX Pro, or even an original TX, like the lime green and gray one, something that's softer on the 75 millimeter side. Like a T1 would be nice. Maybe you're rocking like a T2 Eco or a T2X boot, something like that. Something in kind of that mid-soft category that's not too crazy. Maybe the old Black Diamond Push, or maybe like a Seeker. Those are a little, similar flex models. I never know. I never kept up with Crispy over the years, so forgive me. I don't remember as many of those names. But you get the idea. Softer boot, softer spring setup. Honestly, every 75 millimeter setup probably going to be kind of in that mix, because they're not super active, typically speaking, unless you're rocking like a hammerhead on like, 5, setting 5 or something like that. So that's what I'm looking for in bumps, and it's going to make you such a better skier. And I love that this kind of gives you a jump start on the next year. It gives you the opportunity to jumpstart next year and kind of just make one last push in March, maybe early April, and you're getting some good turns in and you're just loving it, Again, crash. I can't emphasize enough. Let yourself crash. You don't want to catastrophically crash and hurt yourself, but maybe failure is a better word. Failure is the key to telemark. It truly is the way to learn the turn, is to fail over and over, to feel it, to understand where it doesn't feel correct. And that failure is what's going to continue to make you fall in love with the turn and stick with it for a long, long time. So I think that kind of gets me through. If anybody tunes in during the actual live broadcast and you have questions and we need to hop back to stuff, or maybe you want to talk specifics, shoot me something in the message, and then that way I can kind of try to go back and answer. Or if you're watching this afterward, like many of you will, feel free to add something in the comments, and I'll definitely get back to you in the comments, and we can kind of go from there and make it an open discussion for the future. Okay, so for many, many years, spring meant one thing for me when I was younger. And I'm saying, honestly, not even the first, let's see, I started in the early 90s. I mean, the first 10 years, this didn't exist. But I'd say early 2000s, once I started getting into this, every spring, that's when I started trying everything because the snow softened up a little bit and it was just fun, social, and that's park skiing. So, I know a lot of my YouTube subscribers. I can see the demographic. You're probably like, "Come on, dude. I'm not hopping in the park," And I get it because I think there's actually a sort of a misconception of like what park skiing's. It's always the young kid is the park skier. It's not like a thing you do, And I understand that, and it's not for everybody because look, certain aspects of a terrain park hurt. They could, cause injury. So I completely understand that side of it. The funny thing is I look at bumps, moguls, trees, little side hits on the cat track. To me, those are the same things as park skiing. For me, especially in the early 2000s when park skiing was kind of new for everybody, I remember people being like, well, why do you want to park ski on telemark skis? Isn't it harder? And that's sort of the funny history of telemark park skiing is it's like, it sort of continues to happen. People see people in the park on their tellies and they're like, I've never seen anybody do that before. So there's not a lot of people doing it, but they're obstacles, whether it's a little box or something to slide, where you're not going to get hurt. Those are cool, but little jumps are fun as well. And I think just the idea of going in the park, if you're brave enough, and I'm not, full disclaimer, I don't want you to go in the park if it's something you don't feel safe about. But also don't be hesitant to pop in there and maybe find an obstacle. Like when we talk about a box, it's usually like a box looking thing, and they can be different heights, and they're usually wood on the sides, and then they've got plexiglass on the top, so they slide nicely when you get on top of them. So I think what I want to say with that is don't be afraid to go try some of that low stuff where if you crash, it's not a big deal. But part of why I wanted to talk about park skiing, even outside of the park, is what kind of setup you can put together for spring. And this is one of my favorite setups to ski in the spring, park or no park. Just, I love to put this type of setup on so I can go onto a slushy mountain and just cruise around. And funny enough, it actually makes a good bump setup. It's a little on the extreme side for what you need for a bump setup, but as I'll explain here shortly, you'll understand why they're fun in the bumps. So what I'm going to talk about a little bit is a center mounted twin tip setup. A lot of people don't realize that skiing switch meaning backwards. You're skiing backwards, whether you're looking over your shoulder and keeping parallel feet, or maybe you want to try switch telemark turns. And, there's all sorts of variations of going backwards and which lead leg you're going to do when you're going backwards. But that's what's fun about spring. It's a good time, again, to try stuff. So the best way, what people don't really understand, though, with skiing switch or skiing backwards, a lot of times they don't understand that you might just do it on your regular, what I would call a directional setup. It's a setup that's meant to ski forward, and even if you've got a little turned up tail, it's not a true twin tip in the true sense of the word. It might be an all mountain ski, but with a little turned up tail. But what I would encourage you to do, if you want to get a little new flavor, is buy a fully twin tip ski and something that's fairly symmetrical, meaning that the shape of the tip, there's usually the three numbers. You've got the tip width, under the foot width, and the tail width. If you can find something that's got almost symmetrical, like the tip and the tail are close to the same number, that's what we would call like a symmetrical ski. If they're identical, and I haven't kept up on a lot of twin tips over the years, but there's usually asymmetrical ski or pretty close to it with a full twin tip setup. So it's probably fully rounded on both tip and tail. I like traditional camber. I think that makes it easier. A little traditional camber under the foot, full twin tip. That's probably what I'm going to rock. But here's the key to skiing switch, to skiing backwards. And not a lot of people realize this, is if you want to really ski backwards well, it's a lot easier if you do what we call center mounting the ski. And what that means is this, for all the old telemarkers out there, we used to call it chord center. Okay. Later on in the park world, we started calling it true center. All it means is if you pull a tape measure from tip to tail, you take that number and divide it by 2. That's dead center on the ski. So chord center, you used to pull a chord, measure the chord, divide by 2, and then you'd cut it in half, cut it in half or mark it. That's your chord center. So the funny thing with chord center is we used to mount the pin line of a 75 millimeter boot on chord center. What I'm telling you to do is mark chord center or true center of the ski and put the midsole of the boot on that mark. Okay. So we're talking inches of difference in terms of how you'd mount. But if you want to ski backwards, that's the ticket. Okay. My personal flavor when I mount my park skis is I'll usually mount 1 to 2 centimeters back from true center. And that's where I'm going to put my boot center mark on when I do the mount. What that does is it gives fairly even tip and fairly even tail. And so probably makes sense now you're hearing it. But if I'm going forward, I don't have I've got a shorter nose. And if I turn backwards, I've basically got the same distance. So you're literally in the center of the ski. And this is what makes you be able to ski backwards much easier. It doesn't mean you can't do it on like a directional setup, but it's really not that fun because you've got to, you turn around, you're looking over your shoulder, you're trying to make a telly turn. You got these little tails, and then out in front of you, you got this massive, shovel of the ski. I always call it the nose. I don't know why, but kind of like a surfboard. It's like the nose of the board. But that's kind of what you want to do for a park setup. So center mounted park setup. Now, it makes it easier to slide rails if you're going to try that, or boxes. But I'll tell you, this is my favorite. Like I said, my favorite spring setup to rip is a center mounted pair of park skis. Like I said, 1 or 2 centimeters back from center. I absolutely love it because, it's unlikely that it's going to be a powder day when you show up. You already know it's going to be slushy. It's like, 60 degrees outside, you're wearing a t-shirt and you're just ripping fun laps. When you get to bumps, it actually makes a great bump setup because you've got so much tail, you're not going to wheelie out. So even if the tails are soft, you've got so much tail. It's good for moguls, but you have so much less nose. That shovel of the ski is so short. It's perfect for moguls. So that's part of why I like having a park setup and why I wanted to bring it up. Maybe you're not going to jump or, whatever. You're not going to slide a box. But I think the most playful setup that you can have in the spring in a lot of cases is a center mounted park setup where you can hit all the little side hits, off the cat track, and you can ski backwards and try that. I just love it. So, look for a park setup. I mean, there's great brands out there that have always been park heavy, like Line. And, I honestly, if you look at a lot of the Line skis, not the fat powder skis, and I'm talking like maybe 90 max is like where I would be with like that type of a ski, probably like 85. That'd be like kind of the ski I would look for. 85 underfoot, symmetrical, center mounted to 2 centimeters back from dead center, true center. That's going to be the setup. Again, I go soft boots. I want quick maneuvers, and I don't really want to have some stiff ass boot that I'm trying to maneuver around. So kind of the same binding boot setup as I would do for the mogul stuff, I would also do for the park stuff. So that's kind of where I'm going to land on that side of things. So I hope you'll try it. I know, like I said, some of the demographic here is probably like, yeah, I might be a little past that. I totally get it. You don't want to fall and you don't want to crash. But look, we'll just say, if you're like my age, around there, I'm 46. So if you're a little bit younger, a little bit older, not too old, where you're going to break your bones, give it a shot. Park setup, number 2. So we got bumps, and then we got a park setup. And hopefully that gives you kind of a good overview of what type of skiing you can expect to do on a nice spring slushy day. All right, moving on. I did a black level video about carving. Now, you may be thinking, if it's slushy snow, you might not really want a full-on carving setup. I'm not saying it's bad. Again, I like all sorts of skiing all the time. So, if you're looking for like a race day, cold snow or ice, I mean, if you're getting the refreeze in the morning, maybe this is your time to carve. But I still think carving setups are good. And I think it's a great time to learn how to carve, even if the snow's a little softer. If it gets super mashed potatoes out, you're probably not going to have a great time carving, and you might move to one of these other setups that I just talked about. Carving setups are a little bit different than the mogul or the park setup because let's start with boots and bindings. Typically speaking, I'm probably going to want, if I have the choice to get a stiffer boot and a stiffer binding, I'm probably going to go that route if I know I'm only going to go carve. One thing I want to state, though, is learning to carve is one of the amazing parts of telemark skiing as you get better. As you're coming out of the intermediate phase of telemark skiing into the expert phase, carving's rad. And I think it's really it's overlooked a lot because a lot of people tend to not think of carving at a resort as like this thing that you do. And anybody who's followed me over the last, 20 some years of, being in videos and online, I mean, I'm really one of those people that, I like skiing in bounds, and I think it's a really great place to telemark ski. And I really think that the ability to carve, it's like, that's what's rad, is just get there early. This is why I like to go to small resorts now too. Get there early when it's freshly groomed and just open it up wide open, Like, get on those groomers early in the morning. So, okay, stiff boot. I'm thinking TX Pro. I'm sorry. I'm thinking TX Comp, which they've discontinued, but they're coming out with a new one next year. Don't know much about it. Obviously, I don't have a pair, so I'm not sure. Hopefully, it's similar to the old one. A stiffer boot like that, or a T-Race. And when I say stiff, like I've said, I typically think the stiffness I'm talking about is usually in the bellows. So if you're not familiar with most of you at this, if you're a Black Level member, you probably know the anatomy of a boot pretty well. But the bellows, the part on the ball of your foot that flexes, that is where the stiffness lies that I'm looking for if I want a carving setup. Especially if you're like on 75 millimeter. Now, there's not a lot of options there. But if you've got an older pair of T-Race or something like that, that makes sense to me, right? And this is where we're kind of moving into NTN, because most of the older, stiffer 75 millimeter boots are probably clapped out unless you find somebody that stashed them, in a closet somewhere and you found a brand new pair. The new TX Pro, 100% you can carve on it. What I would probably do at that point is try to ratchet up my spring tension, add a stiffy spring on like an Outlaw X, add preload tension to the spring. So even though the bellow of the boot's not super stiff, you're sort of achieving that through the stiffness of the spring. That's probably where I'm going to go with that. If I'm rocking a TX Pro 2.0 or even the old TX Pro, and then I'm going to stiffen up the spring setup. If I'm going to really head out to carve, like that's my focus. So the other thing that we need to think about with carving is a carving setup is generally going to have a narrower waisted ski. You want to be able to carve on any ski, right? But it's again, it's funny because like a park ski and a carving ski, I'm probably in 2025 when I'm making this video, I'm probably landing at 85 millimeters underfoot or 90 millimeters underfoot, ideal waist width of a ski. 95 works, but I think, it's like my Protector 95 skis that I've made. I can carve those hard. But if I really want like a specific setup, I'm probably going to go a little narrower. And there's a lot of skis out there that you can get in like an 85 width. I want to say like the Elan Ripsticks, kind of some of those skis, I think you can get in like an 85. And you'll see that and also like flat tail, unlike we're talking like a turned up tail or a twin tip, a carving ski, you really want to keep more of a flat tail. It's going to hold that edge a lot longer all the way through the turn, where you have to release and go into the next turn. So I think that's a great way to go. Flat ski, 85 underfoot, stiff boot, stiff binding, and watch that video, Black Level member video. Start learning about how to angulate your body, and you can kind of get some tips on there about how to do that. It's really important to learn how to carve, and it makes you a better skier. Quick side note. I felt like I always joke around if I meet people from the East Coast or the Midwest, especially East Coast kids, New England, New York, kind of all those people from like Massachusetts, you're skiing, you call it the Ice Coast, not the East Coast, right? Because there's a lot of hard days out there. And I always joke that if you're east of the Mississippi, you all learned how to ski, like actually use your edges. I mean, for the most part, I moved around a lot, but really when I started really skiing, mostly in the Rockies, our hard snow here is not hard snow there. So being a carving Telemark skier is so good for you. And the biggest step I ever took is I was a Telemark ski racer in the early 2000s for like 2 years. Little known fact, I thought I was going to make the U.S. Telemark ski team. And so I drove around to every race, and I wore the Lycra and I thought I was going to get it done, and I'll tell you the best part of that experience is the training on hard snow taught me so much about edge control and carving and getting around a gate. Again, it's like an obstacle. A gate is like a terrain park, right? It's the same thing. You're just using a different part of your skill set to navigate through them and make these quick turns. And much like we're talking about with all these different setups, it's kind of like you have slalom skis, GS skis, downhill skis. They all sort of have different shapes and sizes and uses and flexes. But I highly recommend, especially early spring. You might still have some hard snow out there. Like I said, the refreeze overnight. Get those edges sharpened up and get a setup like that. Get a good tune. And also, good tune. Make sure your bases are done. Good wax. Get your edges beveled correctly. If you really want to get super crazy, get a little race bevel on there. Talk to your local race tuning shop. Have them do something like that. I mean, that's kind of going to the next level. But you could do something like that, if you really wanted to put like a race setup together. Last thing I was going to mention with the bindings is the height that you are off of the ski affects your carving ability. So if you ever listen to any of like the history stuff that I talk about, I think I was just talking to Mike Hattrop in the podcast about this. If you watched it, I showed like this riser that K2 built, because back in the day we used to mount the toe piece straight to the ski, and so you had this toe piece that kind of hung off the ski, and when you would you'd angulate, the binding would actually hit the ground. I know that I'm using my hands, but you get the idea. Especially with narrow skis, which I just said, you want a narrow, 8,500 foot. You don't want your binding, like the toe part, to hit the ground as you really start getting gnarly and like angling into the snow. So if you ever look at racers, if I highly recommend, look up like FIS Telemark. If you look at the FIS racers in Telemark, they're usually adding even a riser to the built-in riser that's in the binding. So they're super, super high off the ski. And the reason is so they can angulate further, more of an edge, so that they can do that. Angle into the snow, really get on edge. And the more they angulate the body, they angle the ski. So that's kind of what I would say with that is you can add, if you got a Rotofilla free ride, there is a riser kit that you can add, I believe 10 millimeters, even more than the built. Like I said, every riser is pretty much built in. I think a company called B&D Gear, I think, makes a riser still that's like machined aluminum for the Outlaw and the Axle Device, all those bindings. I think if you're, and I love 75 millimeter setups. I think if you really want to get serious about carving, there's a great argument for the NTM platform, only because there's sort of a metal chassis in terms of how the binding's formatted. And when you turn, it turns. So, all right, I think I covered that. Risers, stiff boot, stiff binding, narrow-waisted ski, flat tails, all the way. That's your carving setup, and I think that's número tres. All right. So let's there's two last ones I want to talk about. So spring touring, I mostly been talking about going into the resort, park setups, bumps, things that you're going to encounter in a resort, side hits on a cat track, skiing backwards. But I think getting into the backcountry is obviously a great thing too. Now, there's you could go, I'm not going to talk about this setup as much, but I mean, obviously lightweight backcountry setups, big objectives, volcano skiing in the Pacific Northwest, just to hit on that, you're probably thinking snow stability, long hikes. I guess I will touch on this real quick. I honestly, I think you could really devote a lot of time to that stuff because you're carrying a lot of gear or you're trying to stay as lightweight as possible. And, my go-to kind of stuff for that is I'm going tech toe. Obviously, you got the TX Pro 2.0. That's probably the greatest boot that's been made for that type of thing in a really long time. So you have some incentive to use a boot like that. Again, it's not too stiff in the bellows, which I like. It's comfortable to tour in. It's got good range of motion if you're walking long distances. I'm really thinking like I said, Pacific Northwest people, like long objectives, like you're going to a volcano kind of thing, like Mount Adams, the Sisters, Mount St. Helens, Mount Hood, stuff that has like long approaches. In the Wasatch where I live in Utah, there's some big approaches, but it's not like that. And I don't have a ton of experience up in that zone that I was just mentioning, but where I live, it's not as crazy of maybe it's going to take you a day to get there or massive amounts of hours. There's probably like 4 or 5 hour long tours here, but I'm thinking like Cascade Highway, Washington, that kind of stuff. So TX Pro 2.0, you're probably going tech toe. I'm always a fan of not Majo in that case because I think the plastic could break, but that's always freaked me out from day one that binding came out. So probably like some version of the TTS system, OMG, that kind of thing. Make your own. But when I started thinking backcountry, the fun setup I'm thinking of, kind of like a park setup, is I'm thinking like a waxless pattern with a 3-pin setup or a 3-pin cable. And this is a setup I think, again, kind of maybe gets overlooked, maybe not so much with the Midwest folks or like rolling hills, like Vermont, New Hampshire, that kind of stuff. Funny enough, I was talking to Dickie Hall yesterday, and what I love about guys like that, and he actually said this to me. He points out his window I'm on like a video call with him, and I ski every day, and he points out his window, and I mean it's pretty flat, and there's a little track going out from his house, and he goes, I go skiing every day, and then he told me, he's like, I'm a Nord, meaning I'm Nordic, and I'm so stoked to do that podcast with him, because I think one of the cool things that maybe gets overlooked with a lot of people like him is there's Nordic, really, I mean, this is a Nordic downhill turn, right? That's what a Telemark turn is. It's a downhill technique, but it's a Nordic downhill technique. And I love the idea of just cruising and walking. And that's a lot of around my house. It's kind of these rolling hills, maybe not right out of the cabin like old Dickie Hall. But that's, I think, when I talk about a waxless pattern underneath the skis, I'm talking scaled skis. So a lot of times it's called waxless, because back in the day, that was the wax pocket. So you had double camber skis that had a lot of camber, and you could actually wax the pocket to have what's called kick wax. So when the camber got pushed down, it was stickier, and you could kick off and basically make that, Nordic style step. And, but having those little scales allows you to kind of maybe in rolling terrain, not have to pull skins on and off, and you can kind of walk up more mellow stuff, and then you can go down a little ways, and then you can come back up, and maybe you have a pair of skins in case it gets steep. But I think this is kind of one of the things in spring that's fun. Waxless pattern, maybe go with like a T4 boot, like a low cuff 2-buckle, whatever brand, maybe leathers, and I'm going to talk about that next. But having a type of setup where you can just cruise, you can walk. And I think being a Telemark skier, the most beautiful thing about being a Telemark skier, where your heel is always free, you're a Nord, right? You can make a Telemark turn on a downhill slope, but you can walk up, and there's no transition in terms of on and off. And that waxless pattern is as true as it gets, right? You walk up, you ski down. You walk up, you ski down. And it's shorter, mellower terrain in order to do that without putting skins on. But I think it's a beautiful setup if you can get it. And that's sort of one of my votes for spring setups. Get a waxless pair of skis. And again, I'm not going like super wide powder ski. I'm probably sticking around, 90 underfoot. Just something good. Good all mountain backcountry ski. It's probably pretty light if it's a scaled pattern on the bottom, and then I'm going to rock it. I'm probably going to go with T4s, and I think that's probably a good way to go. All right, moving along. We're going to wrap this up on my favorite thing, leather. All right, this is getting harder and harder to find in terms of finding a good pair of boots it's going to hold up, because all these boots are so old at this point. But if you haven't tried leather boots, and I think all the way back when I started the shop in like 2014, 15 season, that's when I've always had my leather setup, but so this is about 10 years ago. I really started coming back around to wanting to make that a part of my repertoire. Like, can I ski this equipment that I started on in the early 90s? And I did a thing called 30 Days of Leather, where I skied the first 30 days of skiing on leather boots. And it was kind of early days of Instagram, and I was kind of documenting it on there. And leather will teach you more about the Telemark turn than any other setup will. A long pair of 200 plus skis, again, size depending. If you're really, really a lot shorter, I'm 6 foot. So, if you're like upper 5 foot range, like go for the 200s, 205s, 210s if you can find them. But a 3-pin binding and a leather pair of boots on a long, skinny, vintage pair of skis will teach you more about the Telemark turn than any other setup. I promise. What it does is it helps you slow things down. You look at the mountain different. Your discernment is different. How you look at every bump is different. How you look at trees, your response time, everything is different because it requires more attention. And this is why I love leather. And I think it's such an important part of the quiver. Of all the setups I just named, park, bumps, carving, if you're someone who's like, I have one setup, dude, that's it. But I might be able to go to the vintage store or find an old pair of leather boots. I absolutely encourage that. Have a leather setup, have a 3-pin binding or a simple cable binding. Volet 3-pin cable is a really good one that's still made, and you can take the cables off, do a 3-pin day, or you can put the cables on, and it's pretty stable binding. But mount it flat to the ski, no riser, and go have yourself a good time. And again, spring is best because you can maneuver around. You're going to fall a lot. It's not going to kill you. You're not missing a powder day. I hear that excuse a lot. I don't want to learn how to telemark ski because I don't want to miss a good day. Spring's a perfect time to do it. And whether you're intermediate, beginner, expert, I think having that leather setup is going to offer so much in return to you in terms of helping you understand when you go back. It's not going to feel the same. That's why I always say there's eras of telemark skiing. You could bitch and moan about all this gear doesn't feel like this gear and it's not telemark or it is who cares? It's eras of telemark. But the two eras, I think, are the current era that you're in, whatever gear you've got, and then leather will always add something to it. It's the magic ingredient that helps you to understand what this turn's all about and to understand a past time. But also, my prediction, and I don't know if this will happen, I would like to see this happen, but I have the sneaking suspicion that I wouldn't be surprised in the next 10, 5, 10, 20, 15 years, I don't know, if somehow a leather boot similar to like in a Solo Extreme. It's not like soft leather, but it's actually reinforced leather. Lace up, maybe a buckle. I wouldn't be surprised if someone brings it back. And I really, really think that would. I think there's such a love for that part of Telemark that I think there's a lot of people that would actually have that. It's almost like you'd have like a dual quiver where you go to the mountain and like you kind of have like that setup. And like we think of it as like kind of like that OG setup that I've got. And you got your new, NTN stuff. But I wouldn't be surprised. I think Telemark has the potential to maybe have a company bring back a leather boot. And maybe that way we aren't all like gluing and screwing our soles back into our boots. I don't know, maybe wishful thinking, but I think that's a possibility. So anyways, that kind of wraps up my spring setups for 2025. This is some stuff that I absolutely love in spring. I love the type of snow. I love everything about it. And I think these are a couple different fun ways that if you got a couple extra dollars that you can throw at something, or you got an old pair of skis sitting around that fits the bill for one of these things, go for it. Hit me up. If you have any questions on this, maybe you're like, hey, I want to put a setup together you talked about, shoot me a text, 801-450-9986, and we can kind of talk about it. Or team@freehilllife.com. That'll go to me and we can kind of talk it over. But I would love to see what you guys are doing out there, what you got planned for the spring. I appreciate you so much. And I hope you'll check out these upcoming podcasts that I've got and the other videos. So until then, my friends, spread Telemark always. See you later.